Has there ever been a time you've wanted to build something, but for some reason you couldn't? Maybe you didn't have the right tool, the right wood, couldn't find a buyer, or just didn't have the confidence for whatever you wanted to do. If you're anything like me, you can definitely relate to this question. The video that you're about to see is the story of the pedestal table that I've always wanted to try. It took me 4 years to finally give it a shot. It's a bit ironic that I've always wanted to build this table because there's currently a contest hosted by Rockler and Four Eyes Furniture, the Rockler Try That Challenge, to build something you've always wanted to try. This pedestal table build is my submission. So the concept of building a pedestal table really isn't that complicated. You have a base on the bottom, something similar on the top, the center pedestal, and then finally the tabletop. What makes this build so difficult, and more importantly, why this is the challenge for me that I always wanted to try, is because of how that center pedestal will be cut. This will require for me to get a brand new tool I've never used and have zero experience with, which I've got to admit, I struggled quite a bit with, but we'll see that later on in the build. For right now, we'll focus on how I got the pieces of this table ready for that cut, and what you've seen me do over the last minute is to mill up some 8/4 inch hard maple into different pieces which will make up the components of this table. Now it's easy to see that I did a pretty poor job on that glue up, and that's okay because we can clean those edges up with the joiner and the planer. That'll result in us having 4 nice pieces, 2 which will be the top frame, 2 which will be the bottom frame, and they'll be interlocked with a half lap joint. As far as that center pedestal goes, all we really need to do is glue up a really big block of wood. Now there's obviously more to it than just gluing up a block of wood, and the issue comes from the fact that this pedestal will be about 11 inches wide, and since I only have an 8-inch joiner, I can't face plane these boards after they're put together. Now we can solve this problem by gluing up all of these panels individually, and we'll have to run them through the planer to smooth out any imperfections, but then those pieces can be glued together to create that giant center beam which will become the pedestal for this table. Now getting a board or a specific piece for a build square is something that I'd say I've gotten pretty good at over the last couple years. But when it comes to getting a piece this big, perfectly glued up or aligned properly, that can be a task in and of itself. So you might be wondering, well, what's the big deal? Why does it have to be perfectly square? What happens if one of those boards is slightly off? And the answer to that is, well, nothing really, other than the fact that it would throw off the alignment of the entire center pedestal during that cut, and this table would end up looking very lopsided and maybe something like you would see in a Dr. Seuss book, which is not the goal for this build. So as I started to put all the clamps on this center block for the glue up, I noticed those boards and planks were sliding a little bit with the glue in between, and I couldn't get the sides lined up perfectly, which, as I mentioned, would be a problem. The solution to this issue is to take some scrap boards that have been jointed on one side and use them as clamping cauls to force all those boards to come together with a flat surface. This usually works really well, and I actually swapped the cauls out on the top and bottom as I figured that that side would be more important since the pedestal will be setting upward. So after a quick layout check of all the pieces, it's time to make these pieces look like they're actual furniture components rather than just blocks of wood glued together. For these templates, I started out by drawing a grid on a piece of scrap cardboard, and then essentially just freehanded a design, which is roughly just based on a combination of different designs I looked up online. Up to this point, everything we've done has been relatively simple, and this is where the actual challenge of this build begins. This is also where my confidence was temporarily shattered. To learn something, especially with woodworking, you can watch as many tutorials and how-to videos on YouTube as there are, and everyone in the tutorial videos makes it look so easy, but nothing can prepare you for the very first time that you use a brand new tool, which in this case is this bandsaw. And when that blade doesn't seem to cut, and the turns will not turn, and every time you get going, something goes the wrong way, it can really make you second guess yourself and if you even have the skill set to be trying something like this. Here is a look at my best effort on that bottom base, and since that base was 7 inches, resawing through this 11-inch block of hard maple had me thinking I was set up for failure. I think it was just out of instinct or maybe looking for any excuse I could find, but before I made this second cut, I changed the blade on the bandsaw. And maybe I damaged that first blade on the ceramic guides or something along those lines when first setting the bandsaw up. But regardless of whatever the reason was, this second blade cut 100 times better. And by no means would I say that it cut like a hot knife through butter, but it was good enough that I could actually follow the lines and get this pedestal cut out. So with the little ingenuity of taping those pieces back onto the pedestal to keep a flat surface, that giant block of maple from earlier has turned into this center pedestal. Now by no means would I say that this looks great. In fact, it still looks pretty rough. But that just means that I am going to become really good friends with my Rotex sander over the next several hours to get all these edges cleaned up. At this point, I was pretty relieved to have that pedestal cut out, and now we need to build a tabletop, which I've done several times, so I feel a lot better at this. Little did I know that there'd be more unexpected challenges to come with this tabletop. Tabletops are typically easy to build. All you have to do is glue a couple boards together. The fact that these boards had been skip plane should make my job even easier. In addition to that, I have a wider 20-inch planer, so I can do multiple glue ups, run them each through the planer, and then do one final glue up, which should eliminate about half of the glue seams on this tabletop. If you're not familiar with hard maple, it's, well, obviously very hard, but that also means that it's dense. And the denser it is, the heavier that it is. Now, wood being heavy in itself isn't really the problem. In fact, that's probably a good thing. However, wood being heavy means that it's more difficult to work with. And if it's more difficult to work with, it doesn't always glue up properly. The wobble you can see on this section is going to cause a huge problem whenever we try to glue this tabletop up. As I mentioned, I don't have a joiner wide enough to be able to face joint this, and I really just don't want to build a planer sled. So here is an easy fix that you can use to fake a planer sled on the bottom side of the board, which is done by simply gluing an angled shim to the bottom side, which will elevate where that gap is, and then you can feed it through the planer, which will smooth this thing out. You can see the gap there as this goes through the planer, and as we set this thing back down, that new surface will match our workbench perfectly. And if we assume that our workbench is actually flat, all we have to do now is run this back through the planer on the opposite side to plane those shims off, yielding an end result of a board that's nice and flat and ready for the final glue up. One thing that I've learned over the last several years as I continue to make pieces like this is that Woodworking isn't about how perfect you can make every single cut. It's more along the lines of how good you can get at hiding those mistakes and any imperfections you might make. That said, I wouldn't really recommend just throwing something together and hoping to make it beautiful by cleaning up your mistakes at the end. Obviously, you want to minimize the amount of mistakes you make. And that is exactly what I'm trying to do on this tabletop glue up by using dominoes between the joints to hopefully prevent any misalignment as I put these pieces together and clamp them into their final resting place. So as we watch this glue up happen, you might be wondering, why didn't you just buy a bandsaw earlier and give this a shot? And that's a valid question, but first of all, a bandsaw is really expensive. And also, it's kind of a tool that I've avoided investing in because despite as much woodworking as I've done and as many projects as I've built, I've kind of been on the fence about the direction of this whole woodworking journey. Aside from the cost, a bandsaw is a big piece of machinery that can be in the way. And also, I had to hook up new 220 power. So after some internal debate of putting the brakes on this woodworking thing or investing in a bandsaw and moving forward, the end result of that process is, well, this video. So hopefully that explains it. So after struggling my way through cutting the pedestal and the legs out and fixing that wobble in the tabletop, I finally get to do one of my absolute favorite things to do in woodworking, which, no, is not sanding, but rather cutting the tabletop out with a router. It is kind of funny though that after you do something as fun as cutting a circle out, you get to sand that circle down. But these details between sanding the top, the edges, and then using the small roundover bit on the tabletop are really what's going to make this table pop and stand out and look like a great piece of furniture. So let's get this thing put together. As I mentioned earlier in the video, both the top and the bottom pieces will be interlocked, crossed over, using a half lap joint that I'll cut out with the table saw. And this is actually a pretty easy concept. All we need to do is measure the total width of those pieces and then set the blade to half the width to cut out slots in the middle of each of these pieces. You could do this a number of different ways, table saw, miter saw, and it's funny because I actually forgot that I had a bandsaw that would have saved me a ton of time cutting out so much of that wood. So that's exactly what I did on the bottom pieces of the base support. And while giving us the same end result as just doing it on the table saw, doing it this way instead was substantially faster than cutting out the entire thing with the table saw. With everything finally taking shape, it's time to get these pieces put together. And since this half lap joint has a ton of surface area for that glue to adhere to, this joint will be incredibly strong. On the bottom piece, all we need to do is interlock the pieces together, clamp them up, and that'll be good to go. Now because the upper brace will obviously have to attach and support the tabletop, we'll have to think about this one a little more. Normally I'll attach all my tabletops to bases or aprons using Z-clips, but this table being made from solid maple means it's extremely heavy and I need a more secure way to attach the tabletop. I'll be doing this with threaded inserts and furniture bolts, and because these support beams are so thick, we first have to countersink an access hole for that furniture bolt to go through. On the other side, we'll drill an elongated hole all the way through that has to match up exactly with that first hole we countersunk. That way when the furniture bolts run through, they can move, but only in a lateral direction, which will allow for expansion and contraction of the tabletop, which are respecting temperature and humidity differences over time. The last thing that I want to do is build a piece of furniture, a high quality table like this, and have that top crack because I didn't account for wood movement. After that top beam is perfectly centered, we'll use the same Forstner bit we used to drill the holes out to mark the alignment on the tabletop. If you ever used furniture bolts like this before, you know that this measurement is extremely precise, because once everything is assembled and those bolts are in place, there's no going back on this one. As much as I hate sanding and small detail work, I can't stress the importance enough of how important all those fine little details are. And not necessarily to get every single scuff mark out, because some of that will leave a little bit of character, but just to clean this thing up and make sure that all the surfaces look good, because finishing a piece of furniture like this can really be a bummer when you've done all the work, finished the thing up, and then you notice one small spot. For the pedestal to upper and lower base assembly, I'll just be using dominoes. And the reason for that is that dominoes are simply just unmatched in their accuracy and precision whenever you're trying to put something like this together. Additionally, these are the big 14mm dominoes, so they'll add a little internal strength to that joint as well. Having multiple tenons can sometimes be difficult to get everything aligned, and even lined up properly, sometimes it just doesn't want to go. So the easy solution to that is get a bigger hammer. Anytime I get to use a sledgehammer in one of my builds, well, it's always a good day. All we have to do now is check the alignment, tighten these clamps up, and wait for this thing to dry. The finish I'm using for this table is Rubio Monocoat. If you're not familiar with Rubio, it's a wax oil combo that's incredibly easy to use. As far as the color goes, I just mixed a few colors together until I finally got it to the shade I wanted. If you really want specifics, the best I can give you is mostly pure, about a 1/4 ice brown with a couple drops of bourbon. And that's bourbon as in Rubio Monocoat bourbon, not the drink bourbon. Whenever using Rubio, I'll come back a couple days later and use the maintenance oil to up the sheen a little bit. The tabletop will also have an N3 Nano protective coat, but unfortunately due to time constraints, that shot didn't make the video. Every now and then, you'll build something that makes you say, wow, I did that. And honestly, I haven't felt that way about some of my builds for a while, but I think that changed with this project. And I wanted to thank Rockler and Four Eyes Furniture for hosting this challenge and getting me out of my comfort zone. So looking at the end result of this table, did I do a good job? Well, good is obviously subjective, so I'll leave that question up to you. One thing I know is that over the last 4 years, I've learned so much on this woodworking journey, and I wouldn't have stood a chance on this build when I first started. I think that statement speaks for itself, and I'm pretty excited moving forward to see my skill set when I can say I built this table 4 years ago. I often feel uncertain of my work, and sometimes in woodworking, it can be easy to get down on yourself with every tiny mistake, which I think is normal. One thing I'm certain of is that I would have never given this a shot. I'm not sure I would have realized how much progress I've made over the last 4 years. If there's something you want to try, give it a shot. You'll never know the end result until you try. Thanks for watching.